Okay, so now to begin, I wish to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. In order to reflect further upon the meaning of this acknowledgement and to invite others to reflect in similar ways from within their own spaces, I situate myself as a settler of European ancestry who has benefited from the destructive colonial project on this land. This is a violent project which has worked for multiple centuries to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their homelands, cultures, and knowledges, to instead impose settler European lifestyles and values. This violence is ongoing today through the settler colonial project. I have also grown up, as perhaps others of us have, without really reflecting deeply on the importance of land itself. For this reason, I today wish to express my gratitude for the land, for nurturing us and caring for us, and also for the Indigenous stewards and defenders of the land who continue to resist ongoing settler colonialism. I acknowledge my own responsibility to likewise resist and deconstruct harmful colonial narratives, working towards the goals of land back and fostering responsible, reciprocal, and caring relationships, both with one another and with the land. In this spirit of relationship, I am very pleased to present our speaker for today, Marie McLeod. Marie is a PhD candidate in the Department of Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto. Her research is dedicated to providing scholarship to apply an anti-racism lens to Western traditional epistemology, given the dominance of its framing assumptions and concepts. Marie, thank you so much for being here today to talk about your research. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lois. Hi, everyone. As Lois says, my research has to do with applying an anti-racist lens to scholarship with the purpose of making social changes, of trying to put a new lens, a new gaze, a critical gaze on a lot of things that are taken for granted. So today I'm looking at basically the complexity of epistemic racialization and epistemic oppression. A lot of feedback that I encounter while doing my studies has to do with that question, what do they know? Because once you have a lens or a gaze that disrupts, your scholarship comes under, your scholarship becomes suspect. It becomes under review and begin to be scrutinized. Okay, so to begin, there is a canon debate that is raging in academic circles. So I wanted you to know exactly where I'm coming from. So I present my research as a journey for knowledge. And this journey for knowledge is mediated by race, and it's mediated by epistemic relations. It's the idea that there is an epistemic community. And my overall claim is that they're difficult to defeat arguments. They're very hard to overthrow concerning the illegitimacy of race-based epistemologies. The fact, just a second. The fact that epistemologies and their related ontologies, and when I'm talking about ontologies, I am talking about reality making. How do we see reality? How do we make reality? I'm talking about world making. So these are legitimated those that are legitimated in education, within education discourse, they emerge exclusively out of the social history of the dominant white race. It's a key feature of normative epistemological conduct. So in mapping this terrain, there is an epistemic challenge that emerges. So the positioning of Euro-American epistemology above all other ways of knowing. It as the grounding of all understanding and meaning, it gives it a lot of epistemic power. Within this positioning resides a lot of epistemic strength. So there develops an unequal relationship is constructed, between the Western and the non-Western knowledges, and it fixes all knowledge into a set of epistemic norms. So while epistemologies usually are universalized as the archetype of knowledge production, and there's a continuing devaluation and negation of racialized perspectives or theorizing, and it does cause a hermeneutic closure. So theories and epistemologies arising out of non-Western social perspectives, the traditional Eurocentric perspective offer diminished readings, and usually non-Western epistemologies are regarded as not worthy of epistemic worth, epistemic regard. So there's a denial of racialized contribution to knowledge production, and we have quite a few authors who we can look at, who have explicated these similar positions or perspectives. So I do want to explain how I'm using the term knowledge. I want it to mean the way a person explains or interprets reality. That knowledge is socially constructed and it reflects human interests and human values. And we see a few postmodernists like Foucault and Harding and Rorty who have come against these mainstream ideas of knowledge and have presented critiques. But I believe, even though these authors have taken on, these theories have taken on the grandiose ideas and tried to critique them, and there still exists a crisis of knowledge. And I think Amilcar Cabral is one of the authors who have distinguished or really explained what this crisis of knowledge is about. So in disseminating knowledge, if at this starting point where the Eurocentric perspective is superior, there's a creation of a sub-knowledge, and Said talks a lot about this, where epistemology is racialized in terms of whose and what knowledges are privileged and whose are validated, who has voice and who doesn't. So there's a hierarchization of epistemologies that emerges, and the superiority of Western knowing is implicated in the conceptualization of knowledge. So such a model of epistemology, it operates to endorse or to reject educational histories, experiences, cultural memories of groups of people, and it also operates to negate subjectivities. So the idea that emerges is that in order for one to make a claim to knowledge, and this idea of universal truths comes out, Euro-American master narratives have to be deployed. So knowledge production is only attainable through donning the epistemological clothes of the Euro-American. So traditional empirical paradigms and teaching in American colleges, I think Banks talk about this, that this has been the modus operandi. Since then, this empirical paradigm, it's been institutionalized, and this Euro-American ordering is also extremely prevalent in education, and it invisibly frames, the value of knowledge, and that knowledge is emphatically binary. Such construction constitutes a radical form of what Jose Medina calls epistemic death, or what Gross-Vogel calls epistemicide, where there is a conscious, intentional desire to create a kind of death in regards to race-based epistemologies. So we need to challenge the dominance of Western imperial knowledge. Scourge and Young describe it as epistemological racism, where the knowledges of whole populations, tend to be excluded. So I want you to know the conceptual framework from which I am working, and that's to do with educational concepts and models, including those causing epistemic oppression, have been transmitted through conceptual meanings, even to this day. If there is one of the things that we have to grapple with is the idea that the Black person is a criminal. So to fight against a concept such as that, it's a daily routine for us. So the conceptual frameworks that I am engaging as methodology, I am looking at anti-colonial thought and integrative anti-racism education. So looking at the tenets, the axes of anti-colonial thought, it engages the colonial. It is a lens, it's a tool to respond to all forms of colonial domination. One of the main imperatives of anti-colonial thought is to resist Eurocentric American theorizing of the colonial encounter. It wasn't that the slave and the slavery was migrants, looking for work. It was an oppressed people who were enslaved. So this focus makes visible the assumption, the mythology of epistemic superiority as centering Euro-American discourse. And when we look at through that anti-colonial lens, we see that Euro-American discourse is established deeply, as disseminating conceptual meanings of dominance. So this is the lens from which you're working. We have several theorists, Fanon, Ngugi, Linda Smith, which suggests that this superiority established at the level of knowledge production in education in more subversive ways is implanted to colonize our minds. Another lens that I wish to engage is the integrative anti-racist education lens, and this is really the lens of Dr. George Day. And one of the tenets of the integrative anti-racist education is to rupture the production and the spread of Eurocentric language, the epistemol grounding and its epistemic totality. All right. I like it or I think it's fitting, it's not what you like, it's what's fitting, to analyze, and it's the intersectional lens. And that is why we separate it from just anti-racism. It's an integrative anti-racism because of its intersectional lens, and it engages class, ability, gender, language, materiality. It in and it engages these concepts to show how knowledge is constructed and it's interpreted and institutionalized. And it's also extremely fitting and suitable because it centers race. It eliminates the possibility of a racial reality. Its focus gives way to conception of knowledge that acknowledges that knowledge is neither value free nor context free. There is a racial root to knowledge. Okay, so let's look at how this conceptual lens can be utilized, how it can be engaged. Lois, there's just one little thing that's bothering me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to get that section with the participants. It's covering some of my it's covering my screen.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. How do I get it smaller?
Do you mean when people are signing in, right?
Yeah.
You should be able to move it or minimize it.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I can minimize it. I'm so sorry, guys. Just give me a second.
Embrace Marie.
No, I can't.
Is it on the side of your Zoom?
Yeah, it's on the side, but it's too big.
Okay, so if you go to the top.
I see it. Good.
You see it? Okay.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, so let's look at this conceptual framework. So within this context, anti-colonial discourse speaks to decolonization. And it's a term that has become very domesticated. I'm sure you will all agree. Everywhere you turn, people are decolonizing these days. But implicit in the lens that I'm using is a demand for a radical makeover of the analytical and conceptual frames of reference used both in the academy and in mainstream public discourse. This preferred prism is useful to scrutinize and to deconstruct dominant discourses and epistemologies with the view to offer a new philosophical construct, a new philosophical perspective. So I engage this conceptual framework to problematize the marginalization of certain voices and to address questions of epistemic inequities and oppression. So with that in mind, the constitution and the domain of knowledge itself must be interrupted. And this requires a reflection on Western philosophy. You have to look at the philosophical constructs. Kidd gives a very pointed view of what Western philosophy constitutes. She says Western philosophy is imagined always as a light or a gift brought to the hoi polloi by a talented and profound individual or a small group. And when you think about Plato and Socrates, which is exactly where I'm heading with my discussion, we do get this sense of this talented or profound individual, spewing gems. So if the mass rejects the gift of philosophy or doesn't value its contributions, this act alone is often sufficient to define them as barbarians. So from the very onset, we are given the idea that, if your view differs from the mainstream view, you are considered a barbarian. So you're fighting from that lens. So what I used as study was Plato's book, The Meno, and certain philosophical constructs, or rather, Kidd refers to them as philosophical errors, emerged. One of them, the conceptual assumption within Western philosophical construct, is that knowledge produced within it is neutral, it's rational and objective. The very nature of knowledge is transcendental, that knowledge is virtue. So we see that Plato is operating from a kind of moralizing theory. And most importantly, all the principles that emerge from the Meno are considered universal. So there emerges an epistemic totality. And usually for the racialized knowledges, this results in epistemic oppression. I also found this quote from Kidd extremely enlightening. She says, in regards to this notion of epistemic totality, this is an epistemology of ignorance born of imperial and colonial projects of plunder that legitimates a lack of investigation and study beyond one's own domain. So Eurocentrism, she says, has no need to apologize, much less to correct itself. So my modus, well, what I want to do is to offer a theoretical corrective. So with this orientation in place, this epistemic totality, a whole edifice of framing assumptions emerge regarding how knowledge is justified, and it speaks directly to the onto-epistemological framework of the nature of knowing. Plato places emphasis on the foundational significance of virtue in the Eurocentric makeup of knowledge. Knowledge is only found in a place beyond our worldly realities. It is implanted in us by God. So he presents knowledge as having a divine orientation. Its nature is perfect and it's abstract. What emerges in Plato's novel, The Meno, is he places a lot of emphasis on the what is X question, which is central to this Socratic method. The search for knowledge is in questioning. Plato's search for knowledge constitutes what is not known. So he definitely attaches a definitional inquiry to that search for knowledge. And Césaire chimes in and says, this conceptual naming, this conceptual need to define from the European gaze obliterates all that existed prior. Plato's definition implies a certain sameness, a unitary nature of knowledge, a monolithic idea of knowledge, creating a system of logic where thinkers perceive universality and neutrality in their knowing. So with this in place, with this orientation in place, epistemic oppression is inevitable because there's an unequal relationship. Impurity, inauthenticity, they're going to be marked onto the knowledges of the racialized. which justifies white epistemic domination. This foremost positioning essentializes knowledge to an application of a code of transcendence. It's a negation of embodied knowledges. It doesn't have anything, knowledge doesn't have anything to do with the senses. It has far reaching implications for creating divisions among thought systems, and it creates a kind of racial hierarchy vis-a-vis knowledge systems. Smith again reveals racist ideologies have generated dehumanizing representations of the others as, witch doctor, red Indian, tattooed and shrunken head, cannibal in a lot of white popular discourses. And this attests to the epistemic dimension of oppression of the racialized. Continuing with the idea of a definitional inquiry, it has an underlying assumption that knowledge is a static body of knowledge. What you say it is. And this is easily transmitted when it is defined, when it is named, when it is labeled. So the process of coming to know in the manner also is interpreted as involving a hypothetical method. It's premised on the ability to arrive at a universal truth through reason. So rational belief, evidentialism, emerges as the primary epistemic value. All else involving the senses is irrelevant. It bounds knowledge to the empirical. So this notion of knowledge as neutral serves within both fields of scholarly writing as a means of governance and legitimization. Knowledge is retained in a dualistic relationship, specifically to establish epistemic legitimacy. It establishes binary thought patterns, dichotomous thinking, where we get this idea of us versus them. And this is an existential threat to racialized knowledges. Knowledge validation process in which Eurocentric perspectives disadvantages race-based research, and it distorts the lives of racial groups. Oppression is also actualized because we mask the racial, the social, the cultural markers of knowledge, specifically Eurocentric knowledge, which makes it high, and this is highly normalized in the academy. So it leaves invisible how dominance is maintained. So my argument is that Eurocentric knowledge formation is anchored in and complicit with Platonic frameworks and have situated non-European knowing as unknowing and as ultimately inferior. So we have to challenge Western Academy and its processes of knowledge production. So we have to engage a politics of resistance, challenges at the conceptual level. That's where it begins. So we have to challenge definitions, break the colonial code, as they would say. We have to upend the colonial tendency to name and to measure. We have to redefine decolonization. We do understand that there are contested meanings, but if the term is mainstreamed, it ceases to be decolonial. We have to resist this colonial mimicry that Fanon talks a lot about and ground our epistemic traditions and scholarships on indigenous perspectives and knowledge of the colonized. We have to engage readings and interpretations of decolonial that addresses settler colonialism, indigeneity, and issues of land. Decolonialism as an epistemic consciousness must be engaged that complicates and brings multiple readings of the colonial as a site of violence. We must trouble this delegitimization of particular histories and experiences. So One way to do this is to affirm a guerrilla epistemology, and that, comes from Jose Medina. He problematizes the racialization of knowledge. Race as dominance as a concept that has powerful influence on the constitution of knowledge. We must problematize the ontological claims to the primacy of Eurocentric knowing as the starting point of knowledge, cast doubt on the actual universality of the Euro American perspective. Knowledge production has been imbued, they says, Eurocentrically and hegemonically installed within the very consciousness of the academy. So we need to challenge this aggressive ideology that views indigenous knowledges as a subset of knowledge. So in terms of this guerrilla epistemology that I want to bring forward, it involves resisting the notion to hierarchically classify knowledge. We must apply a new paradigms and use wider range of scholarship. We need to problematize efforts that decontextualize and disembody knowing and separate knowing from the knower. So you cannot separate the knower's subject location and regard it as superfluous. We must redefine knowledge in a more inclusive and representative way. We need to obliterate the idea of neutrality by exposing Euro-American knowledge as a local emergence. We need to engage what epistemic relations have sought, how epistemic relations have sought to organize the world, where knowledge becomes a commodity for export, and it's anchored in directives of commercial and corporate agendas, where it masquerades as globalization, where the pursuit of knowledge is reduced to a resource that serves, particular economic agendas. Knowledge in the era of globalization is viewed as a commodity for export. So another important paradigm shift that I am bargaining for is to explore the relevancy of knowledge production for issues of education, to redefine the very concept of education, critically engage issues with equity and unequal educational opportunities, expose as illusion these notions of meritocracy, suggesting that education is equally and universally accessible and applicable to all in educational institutions. It is not. We need to engage race, as the central grounding of guerrilla epistemology, where anti-racist education can strip off things like color blindness and the elusive idea of multicultural education as being harmonious, and racial hierarchies, remain invisible. Bring a critical lens to this model of inclusive education to engage an understanding of a multiplicity of knowledges. They note critical inclusion demands that we redefine success even more broadly. So my talk is to conclude is a clarion call, a call for critical inquiry of knowledge. Mignola explains it is imperative to change the hegemonic knowledge that holds the interpretation of the world in all dimensions of knowledge, from physics and biology to philosophy and theology, from political economy to political theory, from the hegemonic conception of the human and its derivation to post-human, to racism and sexism. The world cannot be changed, he says, if knowledge and the knower of the world do not change. So I am putting forward, I'm arguing for new readings of knowledge. And I've selected a few um, theorists who concur with my view. Siegel says culture, gender, race, and group subordination or oppression are embodied features of those who construct knowledge, and they cannot be neglected if an adequate and helpful theory of knowledge is the result. So, how we create, define, and validate knowledge, Stanfield says, and by extension, reality is determined largely through the cultural context. That was Siegel, yeah, okay. Another different lens of how to look at how knowledge is constituted comes from Banks. He says the knowledge that people create is heavily influenced by their interpretations of their experiences and their positions within particular social, economic, political systems and structures of a society. And Mignola says knowledge then is understood as incarnated and situated, something that the university too often forgets. So to conclude, I'm hoping that knowledge is reconceptualized through my presentation. I argue that we know from a partisan perspective, so I'm not suggesting that what I have put forward is an archetype. I am putting it forward also to be, um, you know, interrogated. Knowledge is a contradictory site of domination, privilege, subordination. Coming to see how knowing is positioned within Euro-American knowledge, we can deconstruct the ways our epistemic worldviews and dominant paradigms of knowledge have been shaped by our racial realities. We can see knowledge as racialized. So instead of Euro-American knowledge being deemed the only knowing worthy of study, institutionalized as the canon, legitimized as academic knowledge in our educational discourse, we can become critically conscious of the need to reconfigure our epistemologies in ways that oppose dominant paradigms, and we can challenge our educators to decolonize the curriculum. And that's my presentation.
Marie, thank you so much. That was so interesting. So much new information and really, really great. Yes, I see some hands, some clap hands. I wish we could all give you a round of applause.
Thank you.
There you go. Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Marie. So I would like to open it up for any questions if anyone has some. Are you comfortable, Marie, if people raise their hands or?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Or type into the chat if they have any questions. I'm wondering, kind of with that last quote on the need to sort of take what you were talking about, and reconceptualize knowledge within the curriculum, for instance. Do you see some changes happening at all? Like, have you seen examples in schools of sort of this attempt to get beyond just like Euro-Western knowledge systems being represented in the classroom?
When I was very surprised when I started my thesis that to be told that, oh, after we had this rich learning, and these kind of robust interpretations, new interpretations of so much having to do with knowledge, I was told, oh, when you're doing your thesis, it has to be empirical, which I was so let down, I thought it was such a betrayal of what we had been doing. So I do get that question when I a lot from those who critique my work, you know, because there's this idea that, oh, we've come such a far way. But here I would like to make a an argument that it's not just about adding, knowledge. I think Mignolo called it perspectivism, where we have all these ideas of, um, what we're putting forward is that we want diverse perspectives. You know, it's a little bit more than that. It's not just an additive. It's a subversion. It's a different way of, looking at how this single truth is elevated, how there is this hierarchization that it simply cannot, it's not easy. I don't want to say cannot because that's why I'm here. Right? It's not easy to be overthrown. So the fact that, more journals take our work, or there are journals that are popping up that have to do specifically with the lens of the underrepresented. It's not just the addition, it has to do with, the responsibility of knowledge. um, it has to do with making, um, education more accessible. you know in this 2022, in our current, century, education is still so elusive for so many. Higher quality, higher education is still so elusive for many. I don't know if anybody had anything to add. I really want it to be a conversation. Anybody?
Thanks, Marie. And if anyone feels like they would want to unmute themselves, feel free.
Hi, Marie, and
Hi.
everyone else. Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been very, very inspiring. I do have a question. I mean, like you mentioned in your talk, that word has been popping up everywhere: decolonization or decolonized curriculum, and things like that. And I'm wondering how we can avoid that performative aspect of it, and how we can avoid just adding things to the curriculum, or just adding a reading here or a reading there, and then say that we did that work. What would it look like to truly decolonize, like the system of knowledge itself in a classroom, for example, or in academia? What would that? What do you envision that to look like?
Yeah. Well, my, scholarship is highly influenced by, George Day. So, I do, understand that there are contested meanings of, decolonization, but, as you say, to really problematize it, I think we have to address key issues that have to do with land. I was so blessed by that, introduction that Lois did, you know, of how she talked about the land, and that, it had been, misappropriated, basically. So I think it has to do with addressing issues of land, issues of settler colonialism, issues of indigeneity. Today, decolonization is so mainstream, it's so domesticated, and it fails, I think, to ground scholarship, in indigenous perspectives, and the epistemic, traditions of the colonized, the marginalized. I think that, decolonization, it must come from the marginalized, because as Fanon says, our very psyches have been, affected. So I think it has to do with, acknowledging the onto-epistemological existence, of of particular concepts, where they originated from, and it has to do with engaging the politics of knowledge. We really need to trouble this ontological claim of the primacy of Euro-American knowledge as the beginning of knowledge, you know. I think it has to do, to talk about, I think it has to, decolonization in terms of the academy has to do with reframing the school curriculum. It is about subversion. It is about putting a critical gaze on structures and the processes of educational delivery. So we're talking about teaching, learning, administration. I think it's also about how we see race, ethnicity, class, gender, religion, language, ability. How we see them as important identities, and I think it has to do with engaging engaging the idea that knowledge can provide social change. It can be a force. Um, sometimes we don't want to engage that part. It can be a force of social change. So to do that, we have to engage relations of domination, relations of power within schooling, bring to the fore certain dimensions of schooling that where power is basically um, made invisible. Mm? So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that question.
Lovely. Thank you, Marie.
Okay.
If anyone else has a question or maybe a comment to further build on that, feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourself. I see some comments saying, thank you, great presentation. I sort of with what you were just speaking on, I think that really goes to what you said about getting away from like the commodity of knowledge. Like I wonder if schools today, like sort of the mainstream school system is kind of using this Euro-Western knowledge as something that will, give students a job in the future and kind of maintain the status quo. So I find it really interesting to think on the ideas that you're proposing to sort of get away from that mindset.
Yeah, it's I think knowledge is the acquisition of Euro-American knowledge, we should say, has become so commercialized. It I think it is associated with this idea of globalization, where knowledge itself, it seems to be universalized. So I do think we have to decolonize the very concept of globalization, where basically the South is mined for its knowledge, and we have a serious brain drain going on in the South. When we really engage the economic agenda, behind globalization, we see that knowledge, Euro-American knowledge, has currency, and I remember one of our colleagues in one of our classes, she was saying a lot of the schools in Africa now, we have the influx of a lot of American schools within the African diaspora, where the principals, the administrators, they're all from the north, and a lot of the schools don't, engage their own histories, their own cultural memories in when they design the curriculum, and it's just quite sad when you think about it, that um, this is like what obtains now in Africa, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. I do see we have a hand up, Punita.
Mhm.
Hi, Marie. Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciated it. Looking at epistemologies and decolonial theories is something that I'm interested in as well. And I'm over at the higher ed department at OEZ. And
Mm.
I guess this is more of like a comment than a question. I'm finding that as I'm going through my research, it's actually really difficult to talk about epistemological frameworks with other researchers because they've never been trained to think about it. So even when I'm trying to like get into these conversations about what framework are we using to even create our research problems and our like create our research questions, those are difficult conversations. And a lot of the times people are just sort of looking blankly. And when you start talking about Western epistemologies versus indigenous epistemologies, and there's even more like blank stares. So I really appreciate these spaces because I think we do need to talk about this. I think one of the ways to move forward when we're thinking about decolonizing our research is having really frank conversations about how is our methodology and even the way we created our problems or like framed our problems and created our questions. How are they anti-colonial or decolonial? And we can't really get there until we have more conversation. So yeah, just an appreciation for this. It was great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Panita. You know, what you said, it resonates so much with me because when I started my research, I got a lot of, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I and a lot of the places that were said to be set up to help us. Um, when I went there, you know, in terms of the methodology that I wanted to use, they were like, oh, they're strictly empirical, and they really wouldn't be able to help me with my research. And I think finding those obstacles, you know, it really held me back for a while in terms of the methodology, of the methodological approach that I would use to do my research. You know, so I do what you said does resonate with me quite a bit. But then there was, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say, just in regards to your other point around, you know, even when we're looking at different locations. So so my thing is looking at comparative and international education. It's one of the things I keep running into is that whole piece around, oh, well, we're bringing in different cultural perspectives, or just because we've partnered with someone in the global South, now we have epistemological diversity. But if we trouble that, then we'll realize that actually they're all operating within the same frameworks, because that's the way we've been trained, right? Is that we have, for our knowledge to be valid, we need to learn how to make it digestible for the West or the global North. And so,
Right. Simpson talks a lot. Sorry, Panita. Yeah, I was saying Jessica Simpson talks a lot about that, you know, that it's not knowledge unless it is Euro, you know, coming from that Eurocentric lens and how much currency. But she also made the point that it's very important to look at who knowledge serves and who knowledge benefits, you know. So these
thank
are
you.
all good directions, I think.
Yes, thank you, Nita and Marie, for those comments. I am cognizant of the time, but I see we have one question that came to me in a private message. Is it all right if I share that with you, Marie?
Sure, no problem.
Okay, so the guest says, thanks for the interesting ideas. I'm wondering if you envision a paradigm shift where a decolonized epistemology replaces the dominant or coexists with it.
Okay. One of the tenets, I believe, you know, the imperatives of a decolonized gaze, that engages anti-colonial thought is the idea that you can't pit one against the other. The idea is not to essentialize my version. The idea is not to privilege my version. The idea is to engage or to impel multicentric multicentric knowledge, different ways, diverse ways of coming to know. It's an understanding that we do not all know in the same way. That is the impetus of what we're trying to do. It's really not wanting to make our knowledge preeminent, but to employ a scholarly approach, where there are broad ideas about knowledge production, and the idea is, as I said, not to make mind the archetype, but to imagine new visions, to have new imaginings by making us by making it coexist. And by no means whatsoever am I trying to infer a multicultural, harmonious coexistence. That's not what I mean, because Eurocentric knowledge doesn't play well with others. It wants to maintain its dominance. So, Foucault won't just step aside and make way for George Day. You know what I mean? So it has to do with opening those spaces for the new imaginings and the new futurities for the racialized, especially new educational futurities for the racialized.
Thank you, Marie. I love how you put that with Eurocentric knowledge does not play well with others. And
no,
kind of just keeping that idea in mind and thinking about, how can Eurocentric knowledge learn to play well with others? So yeah, thank you, Marie. I see another comment saying diverse ways of knowing and a recognition that all ways of knowing are valid and count. No hierarchy of knowledges or domination of Eurocentric knowledge. Thank you, Yetun.
I like that.
Yes, so lovely, Marie. This is so interesting. I really appreciate you coming and sharing with us all today with the CIER. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And thank you all for coming.